2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Well, it's now 9:15 and we're looking at state and federal politics. It's been a busy time and we actually head over to the other side of the country to Western Australia for their state elections as we're joined by the University of Newcastle Associate Professor in Politics, Dr. Jim Joes. They're all in Western Australia. The opposition leader, Bill Shorten, was over there. I think even our Prime Minister was over there helping to lobby, weren't they?
Yes, good morning, Dave. Yes, it's actually a Senate half election. It's the rerun of the Senate election from last year, because as people might recall, the election was declared null and void because they, on a recount, they discovered missing votes. About 1,200 votes had gone missing. As a result, it was ruled that the election would have to be rerun. We're probably not going to get a rerun of the outcome. I mean, what's really interesting about this is that there was a peculiar outcome last time where one of the micro parties got up. I think it was the Sports Party, and the Greens scraped in as well on the second round, as it were, when they did the recount. At the moment, the state of play is for the two major parties. The Liberal Party has 2 seats in the Senate out of that election, and the Labor Party as well. There's a chance for the Liberal Party to boost their representation in the Senate to up to 3, because the 6th seat, the one that's currently being held by the micro party, I should say, is probably winnable for either Labor or Liberal. The Greens, with a bit of luck, should be able to retain Scott Ludlam, should be able to get returned and hold that seat for the Greens. But Dave, it's really interesting that the outcome in 2013 was partly a result of the disaffection between of Australian voters, particularly in Western Australia, with the federal government and federal politics. I mean, it's a malaise across the country in some ways that we are not particularly impressed with the way in which our politicians have behaved over the past few years, and that it's very difficult sometimes to tell the difference between the two major parties. And I think in Western Australia we saw that played out in the preference deals and the way in which the various micro parties had an impact on the outcome in Western Australia. The Liberals have a chance to pull back a seat, as I said, but given the dissatisfaction, the level of dissatisfaction with our political representatives, they have a fairly uphill task. You would think that being in government federally and in government at the state level, there would be a strong chance of the disaffected voters coming back to the Liberal fold, but those disaffected voters are perhaps not likely to come back as easily. There is also the opportunity that often happens in, shall we say, elections that are out of the normal cycle for voters to sort of lodge a bit of a protest vote against either the state government or the federal government or both, and there's a possibility that the Liberals may not be able to pull back.
Could be a bit of voter backlash there.
Yes, that third seat. There's a possibility for the Labor Party, with a bit of luck, to pull a seat their way. And the Greens, as I said, should be able to retain their seat. It looks like the Scott Ludlam's performance thus far has not sort of alienated him that far from voters, and in fact taking a sort of pro-WA stance, as he did in his speech about the Prime Minister and inviting him over with a heavy degree of irony, basically enabled, I think, him to establish some credibility as a sort of rising sort of political star within the West. The federal government has not been, shall we say, performing as well as we would like, or at least individual ministers haven't. And it only goes to reinforce the sense that the political representatives are somewhat, if not sort of out of touch, then I guess we could say that they are not really connecting with voters in the way that they should. Given the developments over the past 12 months, you should have expected the coalition government nationally to have really made some inroads, shall we say, and re-established a stable and credible space. Now, they have, in the sense that we don't have the same shenanigans that happened with the Labor Party and the infighting, but what we seem to have is a number of senior ministers making some quite inappropriate political statements that then bounce back on the government, and then they have to spend their time sort of mopping up where...
You would imagine there could be some real strong unification there for the coalition at the moment across the states and territories. But doesn't seem to be.
You would expect that to happen, although in principle you would expect that, but in practice, and this is the norm in Australian politics, that the nature of our federation is such that the states pursue their own interests, irrespective of their, shall we say, their political ideology of the government of the day. And even though you might have a Liberal government in Western Australia and a Liberal national government as a national government, they don't necessarily operate, in harmony, because the state's interests will be put first by the Premier of Western Australia, and the national interest, as you would expect, will be put first by the national government. And it's not always easy for the state and federal governments to harmonise. In Western Australia's case, Western Australia is a buoyant economy. It's suffering a little, I guess you could say, a small downturn in the sense that the mining industry is slowing down. But basically, the Western Australian economy has been pretty good. The Western Australian government has enjoyed a reasonably solid base of popularity. The federal government, on the other hand, is now threatening nationally, as part of its budgetary plans and forecasts, that it's going to be bringing down a tough budget, and there are going to be cuts to various services, and all sorts of possibilities are being mooted. So there's some worry that what goes on in WA may not be as, shall we say, as good as it could be in its relationship with the federal government. But in some senses, when we see what happens on Saturday with the half Senate election, we can get some idea of whether the level of disaffection is real, or whether it's simply something that sort of we talk about, but it doesn't actually manifest itself in voting terms. The federal government generally, though, is, with some of the gaffes being made by senior ministers, you would have thought that they would have sort of reviewed where they're at and sort of pulled back a little bit, and not gone sort of, shall we say, in some senses half-cocked. I mean, for an Attorney General to talk about a right to bigotry, for ministers, I think it was the Minister of Immigration, to change his story on a number of occasions, it seems, and get his facts wrong. These are sort of basic errors that you would not expect senior ministers to do. One might excuse that, Dave, on the basis of, well, they're relatively inexperienced, so they're still learning the ropes. However, one would expect that Tony Abbott, who is a very senior minister and a fine parliamentary performer, would have perhaps harnessed his troops just a little bit more effectively. Anyway, we will see what happens in the WA area, whether this will, as I said, point out a degree of disaffection with the federal government. Will it be an opportunity to send a protest vote to Canberra, or will the voters of WA push harder towards diversifying the Senate representation? For the Labor Party, getting an extra seat would be a real bonus. For the Liberal Party, it's a necessity, because come July 1, this new Senate will take effect.
We'll look at that more further down the track, and we'll thank you for today. You'll be back with us next Tuesday morning, Jim.
Yes, my pleasure, Dave.
From the University of Newcastle, Associate Professor in Politics, Dr. Jim Joes at 2NURFM 103.7.